Hello everybody, today I want to talk about a mental illness that has led to several controversies in both hospitals and courtrooms. This illness is not only hard to identify because of its unique symptoms, but the very existence of the disease itself is often debated. And that disease, which we'll be looking at today, is Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is an extension of another mental illness known as Munchausen syndrome. Munchausen syndrome can most easily be described as faking your own illness in order to deceive others. And already we have our first hang-up with identifying this syndrome. Say you were to lie about being sick so you could get out of work or potentially win a lawsuit. That's not Munchausen syndrome, that's just making a lie in order to get some certain objective. Whereas with Munchausen syndrome, the goal is the lie itself. People who are diagnosed with Munchausen syndrome will spend months or years of their life in and out of hospitals to try to convince those around them that they actually have a serious illness, when in actuality they have either induced the sickness or symptoms on themselves or are straight up lying about it altogether. The name actually comes from Baron von Munchausen, a fictional cavalry officer from the 1700s who there were several folk stories about him riding on cannonballs and jumping to the moon and other tall tales. In 1951, when Richard Asher discovered this syndrome, he decided to name it after the stories of Baron von Munchausen because this is essentially people telling tall tales in the modern age. The general symptoms of Munchausen syndrome and the way to spot it in the wild is that the patient will never get better, they will not respond to the regular treatment for the illness that they supposedly have, they will be very knowledgeable about their treatment, and will have a lack of visitors or people interested in their case, at least most of the time. As you can probably already tell, there is a thin line between Munchausen syndrome and just trying to get some benefit through a fabricated illness. To the degree, and we're going to look at examples of this, Munchausen syndrome is sometimes only defined by the value of whatever the lie can give. Now that's all Munchausen syndrome, right? Someone lying about themselves in order to get some benefit or attention. Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which we're going to focus on today, is all of that done to another person. Or in other words, whenever someone induces or pretends that there is an illness in someone else so that they, the caretaker, can receive the attention, the fame, etc. And if it really is a mental illness, which we'll talk about the details of it today, then the very presence of it implies the harm of another individual. So today we are going to look at some of the most famous historical cases of this disease, as well as the history of the legality behind it, and ask the overall question, is it even real? I will also say the cases we'll be looking at today involve children, so if that's something that you're sensitive to, then you may want to skip out on this one. But if you are interested in that, stick around after the ad as we break down what is without a doubt the most controversial disease in modern courts and hospitals. But before we get into that, let me ask you a question. When is the last time you felt proud about your breakfast choices? That's what I thought. See, as a kid, I was obsessed with cereals that had an unholy amount of sugar in them. And now, as a pretend adult, I pretend to care about my health and always feel guilty whenever I fall back on those old breakfast foods. Well, if you're looking for something that's great for you and tastes just as good, I would like to introduce you to today's sponsor, Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon is the healthy breakfast option that contains 0 grams of sugar, only 4 grams of carbs, and 13 to 14 grams of protein per serving. Not only that, but it's also gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and keto-friendly. And if you're like me, you're going to hear that and say, oh, okay, so it tastes awful, right? But as the guy who just cleared these 4 boxes and then ordered another month's worth, I can tell you for certain that it tastes pretty fantastic. To the degree that I am almost suspicious. Like whenever these 4 boxes came in, I tried out the peanut butter one first because I love peanut butter stuff. And I sat there for a second like, this can't be right. To which I then ripped open all 4 boxes and began to eat handfuls of each of them because I thought I was going crazy. And while not crazy, probably, I can confirm that the fruity flavor is definitely my favorite. Also, just as a total side note, they also put games on the backs of the boxes. And that's not a huge deal, but it means a lot to me and I appreciate it. And at only 140 calories per serving, I have no idea what kind of sorcery they put into the, well, it is called Magic Spoon, so I guess they were kind of upfront about that. And you can get in on this magical offer today by going to the link in the description at magicspoon.com/Wendigoon and make sure that you enter discount code Wendigoon to get your order for $5 off. You can go to that link and get the variety pack that you see here of these 4 boxes, or get individual boxes, sign up for a subscription service, or whatever you like. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product that they have a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you order it, decide you don't like it, you can get your money back, although I'm sure you'll love it. So if you're interested, check out the link below at magicspoon.com/Wendigoon, or go to Magic Spoon and use discount code Wendigoon to get $5 off your order. Thank you all so much for watching the ad. Thank you so much to Magic Spoon for sponsoring the video. It really does mean the most. I hope you all check them out, link in the description, and we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. We're going to look at a bunch of examples of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but I want to start out with what is considered by many to be the shining example of it. And no, not Gypsy Rose, we'll talk about her later. And that is the case of Mary Beth Tinning. Mary Beth Tinning married her husband Joseph Tinning in 1965. She had her first child, Barbara, in 1967, and her second child, Joseph Jr., in 1970. Everything was going well until Mary Beth delivered her third child on December the 26th of 1971. It was on that day that her daughter Jennifer was born with meningitis and brain abscesses. Because of these complications, Jennifer passed away 1 week after being born on January the 3rd. It seems like this was the switch in Mary Beth's psyche that led to her later atrocities. 2 weeks after this event, she brought her second child, Joseph Jr., to the hospital, saying that he was suffering from seizures and was constantly vomiting. The hospital released him after a couple days because after putting him under surveillance, nothing was wrong and he seemed to be a healthy child. That same day, on January the 20th, Mary Beth brought him back hours later because he had suffered a heart attack. It was too late for the doctors to do anything, and Joseph Jr. passed away. About a month later, on March the 1st, she rushed her first child, Barbara, to the same hospital. Barbara was in a comatose state, and Mary Beth said that she had been convulsing before passing out. Nothing could be done, and after a few days, Barbara passed away, with her official cause of death being listed as Rey syndrome, which is a disease of the brain. In the span of 3 months, Mary Beth had lost all 3 of her children, but this wasn't the end of the story. On Thanksgiving Day of 1973, Mary Beth gave birth to a 4th child. Mary Beth rushed this child, Timothy, back to the hospital a few weeks after he was born, saying that he wouldn't wake up. This 4th child, Timothy, was dead, and the cause of death was ruled as SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. A little over a year later, Mary Beth had her 5th child by the name of Nathan, and was declared dead after, according to Mary Beth, they were alone in the car and he began seizing, then passed out. In August of 1978, Mary Beth adopted a baby named Michael, and 2 months later had a daughter, Mary Frances. 2 months after Mary Frances was born, she was rushed to the hospital for, again, a seizure, before she was revived and allowed to return home. 1 month after that, she was brought back to the hospital again for a heart attack and died 2 days later. In the fall of 1979, Mary Beth had her now 8th child, Jonathan, and then a few months after he was born, he was rushed to the hospital for a heart attack and died there after spending 4 weeks on life support. And I know what you're thinking. How does one person have 7 children die under the same circumstances and no one thinks to ask any questions? Well, you see, it is true that there are certain genetic disorders that make it very hard for someone with those genes to live past a certain age. The medical community around Mary Beth, especially considering the first death in her family took place while the baby was being born in the hospital, that the children simply had bad genes and weren't cut out to live for very long. This theory was thrown out in 1981 when the same thing happened to her adopted son, Michael. The then 2-year-old child was brought into the hospital after he fell asleep and simply wouldn't wake up. This was the first time that the medical community became suspicious of Mary Beth, because up until then it was just a very tragic story of a mother who couldn't keep any of her children alive. But now that an adopted kid died due to a supposedly genetic disorder, that's when people started to look more closely at the case. So then in 1985, whenever Mary Beth gave birth to her 9th child, everyone was watching and waiting for the worst. This child, Tammy Lynn, was born in August of that year, and sure enough, in December, was brought into the hospital after suffering a heart attack. However, this time, rather than what they had previously done whenever the child comes in, they see that the heart is stopped and they just declare it cardiac arrest. They did a full autopsy looking over every part of the child's body and eventually came to the conclusion that the child had been smothered. They then immediately exhumed 6 of the previous bodies in order to do full autopsies on them now that they had evidence, although at that point so much time had passed that no conclusive evidence could be found. And during the interrogation, Mary Beth signed a confession saying that she had killed Tammy Lynn, Timothy, and Nathan, although later in court she would say that she was coerced into doing this. The prosecution essentially believed that she had murdered 8 of the 9 children, with the first one, Jennifer, that I mentioned earlier, being the only natural death because the entire thing took place in the hospital, and as I mentioned earlier, was probably the catalyst for everything. However, she was only ever convicted for the murder of Tammy Lynn and was sentenced to 20 to life. Mary Beth serves as one of the most famous cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and I want to take a deeper look at that.
She liked the attention of people feeling sorry for her because she had lost her children. She's an example of what we call the Munchausen by proxy syndrome, in which a parent uses or harms a child to get attention.
The core theory that was mentioned in the court and with most people that talk about the case is that during the death of her first child, either she was damaged in some way or experienced such trauma that she became sort of addicted to the thrill of it all. And the reason that she's touted as an example of Munchausen by proxy is because she supposedly killed her children in order to achieve that thrill. But if that's the case, then how is it different than any other form of thrill killing? Obviously, the definition of Munchausen by proxy isn't just anyone that kills for a thrill, because then that would loop in any serial killer or cult leader that did the same things because they enjoyed it. And if we narrow it down to say anyone that kills their own family for a thrill, then that would mean anyone who hated their spouse or parents and killed them because they didn't want to be around them anymore would technically be Munchausen by proxy. You could even bring it down further to say specifically children, but then that would mean that any case of filicide counts. And also, there are several other cases of Munchausen by proxy that do not involve the family specifically. It can be a caretaker looking over people in a hospital, or even through parasocial relationships online where someone on the internet convinces someone else that they're actually sick. I'm going to talk about the specific example and reasons that I feel this way in a little bit once I've shown more evidence, but I don't think that this famous case of Munchausen by proxy is actually Munchausen by proxy. See, from the 50s, when this was discovered, to the early 2000s, there was this huge push to call anything that involved child abuse a form of MBP, which I'm going to call it from here on because Munchausen by proxy is a long word. And because of that, there were several cases of someone just murdering their spouse or murdering their children where some psychiatrist would come in and say, oh yes, this is a classic case of MBP. During the court proceedings, Mary Beth said that the reason she killed her 9th child is because she was so paranoid and afraid that the child was going to die that she kind of just wanted to get it over with. Which definitely points to some mental illness in her life, but I don't think it was MBP. See, that's where the challenge comes with identifying this thing. It seems that the nature of the disease itself is in the intent. See, as it's defined and as the more infamous cases exemplify, again, except for the Mary Beth one, MBP is most often about control or the burnout that happens during the time that someone is made ill. It is about someone affecting a domain that they have control over in order to maintain or secure a massive form of control on it. The cases we're going to be looking at today are about parents doing that to their children, primarily mothers, but it can also be seen in cases such as whenever men have MBP to some degree, it is most often in a cult or religious setting, in which the leader establishes themselves as the most important aspect of someone's life and then makes them ill or physically diminishes them in order to ensure that. The reason that 97% of Munchausen cases involve a mother abusing their child is because that is the most clearly identifiable way to see that behavior. For example, I've talked on this channel about the Anthill Kids cult and how Roche Thoreau had tortured these people and literally cut off their limbs at points in order to maintain his status as their leader and father figure. Whenever you scale that dynamic down to a household, that is most often what Munchausen by proxy is. And yes, I'm saying that cult leaders are also a form of MBP, but I guess we're just not ready for that conversation yet. That is, if we consider Munchausen by proxy to be about control, or at least control can be an aspect of it, because the other big aspect of it that most people know is the idea of attention. And while control is a massive element in that there at least has to be control in order to keep the facade going, several believe that the primary incentive for MBP is the sympathy and attention that is given for this person with the savior complex who seems to be caring for an individual. Let's look at an example of that with Lacey Spears. In 2009, Lacey Spears gave birth to her son Garnet Spears and only 9 days later brought him back to the hospital. She insisted that Garnet couldn't eat and was in constant pain. From there, a cycle began of her bringing him to the hospital, saying that he had all of these extreme illnesses that he needed minor surgeries for. And when Garnet was only 8 months old, he had a feeding tube put in because, according to Lacey, she couldn't get him to swallow anything, and when he did, he would just throw it back up. Not only that, but Garnet had a surgery that closes off part of the throat in order to prevent someone from throwing anything up. During this entire time, she had a blog and a Twitter account known as Garnet's Journey that talked about the details of Garnet's stories in and out of hospitals. Over the years, Lacey and Garnet went to dozens of hospitals, with the primary story being that he has some kind of weird food intolerance that leads to all of his symptoms. It was also believed that Garnet had cystic fibrosis, as his sweat tested positive for high concentrations of salt. Around the time Garnet was 5 years old, they began living at a holistic farm in New York State. Her stated reason for this being that he couldn't eat any processed foods, so if they went somewhere that was all natural, maybe he would be more okay. However, people around Lacey became suspicious because whenever Garnet was away from Lacey, he would eat a ton of food all the time, ask for seconds, and never seem sick. However, after spending any amount of time around Lacey, he went back to being an ill child. One day in January of 2014, Lacey rushed Garnet to the hospital for seizures. After spending some time in the hospital, it was determined that Garnet was completely fine, and he was even jumping on the bed and running around and acting like a normal kid. That was until an event that was later seen on security cameras of the AEG in the hospital room. Garnet and Lacey went into the bathroom, and whenever they came out, Garnet was incredibly ill. He began seizing, to which nurses ran into the room to try to help him, but it was no use and Garnet passed away. The police were called when this happened because it was incredibly suspicious to the hospital that the perfectly okay kid spent a few minutes alone with his mother and is now dead. Also, the police were more suspicious of her when after Lacey's father showed up to the hospital. See, Lacey's story was that the father of Garnet was her fiance, who was a cop who was killed on the line of duty. So whenever the police are at the hospital and Lacey's dad comes in, they're like, oh, we're very sorry to hear about your son-in-law passing away, being a police officer and all. And the father was confused because she never had a fiance. And as a matter of fact, the Blake guy that she used pictures of and said was her fiance was a random cop that she went on a date with like 7 years ago. And if this wasn't suspicious enough, Lacey's friend received a call from Lacey right after Garnett died, where she asked her friend to go to the apartment and throw away all of Garnett's feeding bags. Because remember, he was on a feeding tube, so whenever he was with his mother, he had to eat through one of the feeding bags. When police walked into Lacey's house, it was all of Garnett's medication on the table, and a giant canister of sea salt right in the middle. See, as I mentioned earlier, with cystic fibrosis, one of the major symptoms is a high concentration of salt in someone's sweat. And after it was discovered that the feeding bags in Lacey's apartment had insane amounts of salt in them, something like 70 packets of salt lining the inside of the feeding bags themselves, it was determined that the reason Garnett was sick for his entire life was because his mother was feeding him absurd amounts of sodium. Directly pouring salt into someone's feeding tube causes a plethora of health conditions, which would explain why anytime he was around his mother, he was incredibly ill. But it was determined that the final cause of death that killed Garnett in the hospital that day was salt intoxication. As a matter of fact, his official cause of death was swelling in the brain due to a sodium overdose. And in the hospital bed, after she was arrested and there were search warrants on her phone and everything else, they figured out that while she was in the hospital room, minutes before Garnett died, she was Googling on her phone things like salt poisoning and how much salt to kill someone and blah, blah, blah. So she had been poisoning with salt for years in order to make him appear ill and cause symptoms that were distinguishable to some doctors as being part of cystic fibrosis. So if she's telling the truth on that, she's probably telling the truth about other stuff wrong with him. And then there in the hospital, she overdosed him, which ended up killing him. Here's the thing. I don't think, and I don't mean this in a morality way, not like this exonerates her at all. I don't think she meant to kill him that day from like a purely objective basis. Like, essentially her son was her toy. She used him in order to get clout online and to appear interesting and garner sympathy from strangers and all of that. And I think the reason she was Googling that on her phone is because she was like, oh man, if we leave the hospital now and he doesn't look sick, that's going to look really bad on me. So I'm going to get him super sick, like to the point of death, and then they'll all believe me, which is almost arguably worse. To which she was convicted for the murder of her son, and the judge during the court proceedings even said that she had Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
Instead of nurturing and protecting a beautiful child, you subjected him to 5 years of torment and pain. One does not have to be a psychologist to realize you suffer from a mental illness, known as Munchausen by proxy.
Now, looking at all the details of the Spears case, that is identifiable and easily seen as definitive MBP, like down to the control aspect, down to the attention aspect, all of it. Now juxtapose that to a different case that is also often considered MBP, like the case of Blanca Montano. In 2011, she was convicted to 13 years of prison for the poisoning of her young daughter. Essentially, she had been poisoning her daughter for years with E. coli bacteria in order to make her sick, and at one point even wanted a marrow biopsy done to try to determine what her illness was, and was caught whenever she was seen again on hospital security cameras contaminating her daughter's food with E. coli samples. It was determined in the court trial that followed that she was doing this in order to garner attention from the child's father. Essentially, they had hooked up and she became pregnant with the child, and then he didn't want anything to do with her, so she thought, oh, if my daughter gets sick, maybe he'll come back. While absolutely tragic and evil, this is often considered a case of Munchausen by proxy, and I don't think it should be. Similar to the example I gave earlier about lying about having an illness or whatever in order to achieve an end goal, this is just that with more heinous and longer steps. And I think whenever you take something that is considered by some to be a legitimate mental illness and considered by others to be an excuse, so to speak, in legal systems, and when you just kind of like flippantly apply it to everything, like, oh, this woman murdered her kid, that's MBP, or, oh, look, this girl almost killed her kid in order to get the kid's father back, that's MBP, it kind of becomes a meaningless term. See, if we look at it by just the specifics or symptoms, so to speak, that you can identify MBP through, then Blanca Montano had all of the symptoms. She had a ton of knowledge about the condition that her daughter had. She had the multiple hospital visits, she got into fights with doctors about it, etc. But the motive wasn't there. Someone who, again, I keep using the lawsuit example, but it's the easiest. Someone who's trying to win a lawsuit against, I don't know, McDonald's because they got poisoned of a Big Mac. I don't know why my brain went to that. May do the same thing in a hospital in order to win a lawsuit, but it doesn't mean they have Munchausen syndrome. To effectively narrow it down, and this is more so the consensus in modern psychology circles, it needs to be stated as the motive behind the thing that is happening. And because of that, you may be asking yourself, or just in general, if you think this video is dumb, you may be asking yourself, well, why does this matter? Why does it matter what MBP is, or if it's misidentified, or given the wrong attributes, or whatever? Like, if it's just a means to an end, then why should anyone care? If someone poisons their child, and we're all like, oh, but then they're like, but they poisoned their child by proxy, do we all go, And while it may not matter on an individual basis, like if someone's poisoning their child, then they're poisoning their child. I don't care if they have an affinity for it, get the child away from them. But where it absolutely matters is in legal cases. Because depending on how we define it and how we attribute it as a mental illness, it could imply that it is a mental illness that the very presence of suggests that the individual is guilty. Think about it. Imagine if you have someone who is standing trial because they supposedly abused their child. And if the evidence is kind of in the middle and the jury's essentially hung on what the verdict is, but then you have a doctor come in and say, oh, well, they give the symptoms of having Munchausen by proxy. Well, then that would mean that the very existence of the mental illness means they're definitely guilty. And as I mentioned earlier, the very concept of this mental illness is a little shady in itself, because if it is something that person is preconceived to, then that would theoretically mean that they would have a more lax treatment in a court of law. It's primarily the latter point, as well as the fact that MBP is a rather recent discovery and has circumstantial evidence at best for it existing, that the American Psychology Association has never officially named it as a mental illness. At least they've never named it by name, but I'll talk about that in a bit. That previous point that I mentioned, that its presence implies guilt even if guilt is undecided, led to a ton of controversy in the 90s and 2000s. Primarily due to a doctor by the name of Roy Meadow. Roy Meadow was the doctor who kind of championed the idea of MBP and made it what it is today in modern courts and medical circles. However, that had some major consequences, such as that of the case of Sally Clark. In 1999, Sally Clark was convicted for murdering her 2 children. During the trial, the evidence was kind of circumstantial. Both of them had been found dead in the home, supposedly they just quit breathing. And similar to the Mary Beth story that I talked about earlier, she rushed them to the hospital and both of them were dead. However, in the midst of this trial, Roy Meadow comes forward as an expert witness and begins talking about how Sally Clark has all the symptoms of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and how that means she was definitely likely or in favor to murder her children. The jury, thinking that this testimony was evidence of a motive, convicted her for the murder of her 2 children. 3 years later, lab tests were done and it was determined that the children died due to a rare illness. And then even more tragically, due to all of the shame she received during this, 4 years later, Sally Clark died due to alcohol poisoning. Because of this, Roy Meadow was hyper-analyzed by the courts, saying that maybe him showing up and accusing women of having this syndrome that he's really in favor of making a popular deal isn't the best idea. And during the investigation of Roy Meadows, 2 other women who were put away due to his testimony of MBP were let go after further results showed that they were innocent. He had his license taken away from a year, and then it went back, but then he wasn't really asked to show up at any trials anymore. But that in itself shows the harm that MBP can cause just by existing. Because if you have a case where it's undecided if the person is guilty or not, and then you're like, hey, Do you know that they have a rare mental illness that means they will definitely always hurt their child for attention? How is that not going to throw a jury's opinion? It was because of this Roy Meadows drama that in UK and Australian courts, Munchausen by proxy is legally not a medico-legal entity. Medico-legal, that's a great word. In other words, within the courts of the UK and Australia, Munchausen by proxy legally does not exist. It can be used as a description of one's behavior, but not as a diagnosis or entity itself. The reason for this being, MBP is essentially all the motive someone would need. The example that the courts use is like this. If you have a doctor who goes forward, say there is a mother who murdered her child, and the doctor is talking about how, oh yes, well, the child was asphyxiated, and this is the symptoms that prove it, and this is the logical evidence that shows what happened to the child, and blah, blah, blah. That is all in the realm of physical facts and biological details, etc. But then, if you consider MBP to be a mental illness, and then you have the same doctor go, yes, and the mother absolutely has MBP, that is the motive being shown through a kind of hazy, technically factual mental illness, meaning that a motive can be derived from logistics, and that's why British courts kicked it out. In other words, it can ruin a trial because someone with MBP will always harm a child. And also through this entire video, I've used the example of a parent and a child because that's by far the most common example, but like I mentioned, it can also be done with things like religious groups or nursing providers or elder abuse, etc. But because of everything that I just mentioned, if Munchausen by proxy is real, then it is an illness without innocence. Because if you have it, then you've absolutely done the thing that you're being accused of. And again, this is the reasons that most of the courts kicked it out, and it's the reason the United States is not even considered a mental illness. However, Munchausen syndrome, the one where you think that you yourself have the disorder, is absolutely considered real. And there are far more cases of someone pretending to be sick in order to garner attention and sympathy and what have you than there are of people doing it to someone else. As a matter of fact, the two are sometimes seen together, as is the case with our next example we're going to look at, Hope Ybarra. Now, Hope had a history for lying in the first place. She was a chemist with a doctorate, and in 1998, she told her husband that she was getting a, quote, 1-year PhD degree. To which on every Tuesday and Thursday for 1 year, she would leave the house and I guess drive around and do whatever, and then come back and say that she went to class. After supposedly getting this PhD, she began to call herself PhD Hope Ybarra, as well as put the title on business cards, when again, she never actually got a PhD. After her first daughter was born, she claimed that the daughter had cerebral palsy. Not only that, but for the first year of her daughter's life, she said that she had an autoimmune disease and made her wear ankle braces. However, a year later, when her second daughter was born prematurely, that took all of Hope's attention. So much so that she simply took the braces off the first child and said that she got over it. In 2001, Hope said that she had been diagnosed with bone cancer, and for the next 8 years began to perform acts that showed symptoms of the illness. She would leave the house and shave her head and eyebrows and tell people she was going through chemotherapy. She would make up stories about how it was spreading to other parts of her body but was leaving in some areas, and constantly kept her health in a sort of teeter-totter. She moved to Alabama for 8 months, saying that the region had a special treatment that was only available there. She even learned sign language and had a cochlear implant installed because she said that the cancer was affecting parts of her brain and was eventually going to cause her to lose her hearing. She even had this entire story that she was pregnant. She told everyone else around her that she was pregnant, and for 5 months wore maternity clothes, said they were twins, and even had names picked out for them. Before one day saying that the chemotherapy caused her to miscarry, to which, with no one else around, she had a quick funeral for them, placed them in urns, and then put the urns on the fireplace. The urns were sealed, by the way, and after everything I'm about to talk about happened, they broke open the urns and they were just empty. Remember the second child that I mentioned, the one that was born prematurely? Well, at a young age, Hope had a feeding tube installed in her second child.
Getting a G-tube, a gastrostomy tube to feed the child, is the most common procedure in medical child abuse. And that's because it's probably one of the easiest disorders to fake to a physician. So you present with a feeding issue with your child. Well, we're not watching the child eat in our clinic.
And just as with the Spears case, began to feed her daughter salt, and then doctors believed the child had cystic fibrosis. She even had an intravenous central line put in on that daughter, which is essentially an IV that goes up to or into the heart, and it's believed that she began removing bits of her daughter's blood in order to make her appear anemic. During one procedure called an iron dextrin infusion, which is something they do with dangerously anemic people to try to put iron back into their system, the daughter nearly died because, again, they're trying to flood iron into a system that, for one, doesn't need it and is also lacking on blood. And if it wasn't for the doctor's quick working, she would have died of metal poisoning right there. See, Hope was also a chemist, and because of her fake PhD, which I have no idea how no one certified at any point during this, she had a position at a pharmaceutical company working with pathogens. The way she was found out is because people at work got suspicious that she was ordering pathogens that weren't being used in the lab. She was eventually caught for this after it had gone on for 10 years, and she was arrested for child abuse and misusing justice and lying to hospitals and a whole bunch of other minor charges. She still keeps up the compulsive lying thing to the degree that in one of the interviews I watched with her, whenever she walked up to the interviewer, she had a piece of paper that said she was deaf or hard of hearing. And like in the beginning of the interview was doing sign language and had like a speech impediment. But as the interview went on, she just quit doing that.
Factitious disorder, or Munchausen's, is when someone exaggerates, feigns, or some people would call it malingering an illness or creating an illness that doesn't exist.
So at the very least, Hope was a compulsive liar. Which begs the question, is Munchausen syndrome by proxy just some form of elaborate compulsive lying? And I won't spend as much time disproving it as I did the thrill kill argument, but in short, no. See, there are people who are compulsive liars who don't do things like destroy the livelihoods of family members and then poison their children for a decade. So while that is definitely an aspect in MBP because it requires some level of dishonesty, there's something more to it than that. There is something else to the level of depravity that these people will reach to. And also, in case I haven't made it clear enough, because I'm kind of just playing devil's advocate on every side of the aisle at once, I am not trying to state in this video that it definitively is a mental disorder or isn't or whatever. I'm just more so trying to show the points of it, and while there are proponents on both ends. And the most definitive point that I'm trying to get to you in this video is that it is an interesting point of contention within medicine and legal systems that I think deserves to be looked into. And also, in case it's not clear enough, I am a YouTuber who makes videos about stuff that I think is cool and neat, and not a doctor or a psychologist at all. So, to just clear everything up here, do not take the things I say in this video and then use them as a justification to label people or talk about like what someone may or may not have, because that would be not good. Again, just taking something that I think is interesting and worth talking about and showing that to you guys. So while I'm on the high horse of being a guy with a camera and YouTube channel who thinks I can classify mental disorders, let's talk about Jack Barron. Jack Barron murdered his wife and then at the funeral seemed to be garnering and loving the attention from everyone, as well as cashing her life insurance policy, before doing the same thing with his 2 other children. He seemed to be so comfortable with the deaths of those in his immediate family that at the second child's funeral he wore a t-shirt and just drank beer and like casually talked to his friends. And it is a point of debate if he was doing it because he liked the attention or if he hated his family or if he liked the life insurance policy. And again, while this is a combination of attention, control, and wealth and is garnered through doing bad things to members of your family, I don't think this is Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Again, everyone touts it as such. If you search guys with MBP, he's one of the first stories that'll pop up. However, again, if we take what is potentially a very diverse or specific disorder that can be attributed to some people and just say anyone that murders someone to get a life insurance policy counts as it, then it's a meaningless term. And again, my purpose with all of this isn't to say, yes, it is a mental disorder, because that would imply some level of alleviation or predisposition to the things they're doing. And in every one of these cases, I feel that the individual in question was absolutely capable of moral decisions, or at least if they weren't, it's not related to the MBP. But where I feel it is more important is with the condemnation of those same behaviors. In other words, maybe if we don't look at it as a mental illness and we look at it in the way that British courts describe it as a description of behavior, then perhaps it should be used to condemn those who match the description. And if we're using that definition, that it is not necessarily a mental illness, but instead just a pattern of behavior, then I believe that one of the best examples of why someone with MBP should be condemned and actions against them could be justified is that of the most infamous Munchausen by proxy case probably ever now, which is the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Dee Dee Blanchard gave birth to Gypsy Rose Blanchard in 1991. At only 3 months old, Dee Dee took Gypsy to the emergency room, saying that she was suffering from sleep apnea, although there was no evidence of this. At a young age, Dee Dee began to tell people that Gypsy had chromosomal disorders, muscular dystrophy, and a series of other conditions that caused her to be very sickly and require a walker. At 8 years old, Gypsy was on the back of a motorcycle being driven by her grandfather, to which the bike gently tilted over and Gypsy scraped her knee. From this, Dee Dee said that Gypsy's legs were destroyed and that she now had to sit in a wheelchair. And from there, Dee Dee began showing off Gypsy everywhere. They went to Special Olympic events, they went to pageants for disabled children, and sometime between kindergarten and the 2nd grade, Dee Dee pulled Gypsy from school in order to homeschool her. Every single minor thing that was potentially not even wrong with Gypsy caused Dee Dee to immediately rush her to the emergency room, to the degree that if Gypsy coughed, that's a trip to the ER right away. Dee Dee also began saying that Gypsy was suffering from eye and ear problems, which she also didn't have. And Dee Dee was able to put Gypsy on various medications for things such as seizures. Dee Dee and Gypsy were victims of Hurricane Katrina, and because of it, they lost their homes as well as all information about their previous lives. Because of this, Dee Dee was able to change their names and fabricate an entire medical history. As a matter of fact, her name wasn't even Dee Dee Blanchard. That's a fake alias she gave herself in order to get in and out of hospitals. Her real name was Claudine Pitry. And from there, they became a massive news story. See, to everyone else who was watching, Gypsy was a child with various medical problems who lost her home in Hurricane Katrina. And because of this, they had a house built by Habitat for Humanity. They had several stays in the Ronald McDonald House. They went to several Miranda Lambert concerts and got to meet Miranda Lambert because of Make-A-Wish. And the Make-A-Wish Foundation also sent them to Disney several times. During this entire time, Gypsy's father kept wanting to come meet Gypsy, and Dee Dee just told him not to come around and stay away, normally by lying and having to reschedule and other complications. But at the same time, Dee Dee was telling everyone else that Gypsy's father was an abusive alcoholic who they were in hiding from. Whenever Dee Dee was eventually confronted by the police about changing her alias, her story was that they were hiding from Gypsy's abusive father, so they changed their name in order to protect themselves. She would also do things like shave Gypsy's head, as well as even lie to her about her own age. Like on Gypsy's 18th birthday, her father called to wish her a happy birthday, and Dee Dee said, "Don't tell her that she's 18, she thinks she's 14. And everywhere they went in public, Dee Dee would attach a feeding tube and oxygen tank to Gypsy's wheelchair. Keep in mind, through all of this, she didn't need any of it and was perfectly capable of walking, and Dee Dee simply managed to make Gypsy play along through physical and verbal abuse. Gypsy would later say that anytime they were in public and she would say something that implied she wasn't that sick, her mom would squeeze her hand or kick her under the table, and then whenever they got home would physically beat her with a coat hanger or yell at her saying that she was being a terrible daughter. There were various minor surgeries too that Gypsy didn't need she was given, such as a bar placed in her mouth because the seizure medication she was taking caused her to lose her teeth. Her salivary glands were removed because her mother said that she was over salivating, which, according to Gypsy later, every time they'd go to the doctor, Dee Dee would rub like this tar in her mouth that would make her salivate more, so her salivary glands were removed. She even had tubes implanted into her ears for drainage, which again she didn't have. The first and only real backlash Dee Dee got during any of this was one neurologist who examined Gypsy and then told the mother, "This child is perfectly capable of walking," and the mother got offended and walked out, as well as an anonymous call that was made in 2009 to the police department saying that Dee Dee was not her real name, and also she is just making the child pretend to be sick and she's not actually sick. To this day, no one knows who that call was, but whenever the police went to Dee Dee and confronted her, the police said that, yeah, this looks like a sick kid. And then Dee Dee gave the whole story that they were running from an abusive husband, and the police just didn't look into it anymore. Things began to culminate as Gypsy got older. As a matter of fact, one of the only things that Gypsy had any say in was her internet activity. One year she went to a convention and hooked up with a boy that she had met online. Dee Dee found out about this and threatened to report the boy to the police if he ever said anything to Gypsy again, because according to Dee Dee, Gypsy was a minor at the time, even though she really wasn't. After they got home from this event, Gypsy said that her mother smashed the computer with a hammer and then, for several weeks, handcuffed Gypsy to her bed. After this, Gypsy began to plot how to get away from her mother, and every night after her mother went to sleep, would talk to people on the internet. It was during this time she met a man by the name of Nicholas, and they began, I can't believe I'm using this word, e-dating. And after one meetup where they actually met each other in person, in June of 2015, they decided that Nicholas would murder Gypsy's mother. To which one night, Nicholas broke into the house, stabbed Dee Dee to death, and Nicholas and Gypsy then escaped. During this escape was also the first time that Gypsy had been in public without her wheelchair since she was 8 years old. Eventually, the two of them were caught, Nicholas getting the brunt of the punishment as he was the one who actually carried out the murder, with Gypsy being sentenced to 10 years in jail. While speaking about her mother in an interview she did with BuzzFeed in 2018, Gypsy said she would have been the perfect mom for someone who was actually sick. So again, speaking overall about MBP, if it does exist, then Dee Dee Blanchard is the textbook case. She managed to control every aspect of Gypsy's life, she benefited from it financially, and she garnered all the attention she wanted during this time. Not only that, but she didn't kill her daughter and seemed to continuously use her as a tool to achieve her desires. So if this is the true, undeniable case of MBP, then let's ask ourselves, if MBP serves as a mental illness, does that exonerate Dee Dee from what she did to her daughter? No. There are absolutely cases with mental illnesses where someone does wrong things because they're either incapable of stopping themselves or controlling themselves from those urges, or they're just incapable of justifying or determining what is right or wrong. However, even if you view Munchausen by proxy as being a mental illness, Dee Dee was capable of knowing that what she was doing was wrong. Hence the series of hoops she jumped through in order to lie about family members, and lie to the police, and lie to doctors, etc. She was not incapable of discernment. As a matter of fact, she was really good at discernment because she knew exactly what traits to hide and what traits to exhibit, like care and love for her daughter. So if we go off of this as the ideal case of MBP, then we can agree with the courts and say that it is not a justification for behavior, but perhaps a motive for one. So if Dee Dee essentially knew better, and it wasn't something that overcame her, and she followed her own selfish desires in spite of knowing what was wrong, then in that case, MBP absolutely serves as a way to condemn certain actions. If it's a way to describe a particular pattern of behavior in a person, then it can certainly be decided as a motive for legal actions. As a matter of fact, in American judicial systems, this is kind of the take that's currently being used. The name it's given in American legal systems is fabricated or induced illness by caregivers. That's not as cool as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but it's the same idea. Because it's not used to describe a syndrome or a mental illness, instead it's describing a behavior, an induced illness by a caregiver.
I've seen a number of these. They don't give the child the proper medicine, and they keep going to the doctor and telling the doctor, you're not trying hard enough, you don't understand my child, here are all the symptoms they're having, and the doctor's puzzled. And of course, most doctors and most professionals and most people don't even consider the fact that they're feigning this illness.
So if we look at that, fabricated illness by caregiver, which is abbreviated to FIC, and since MBP and FIC are the same thing, at least in a legal aspect, or as we decided from this point of conversation that it is not a mental illness, and since Dee Dee Blanchard exhibited FIC, the big question is, does that justify the actions of Gypsy? Yes. In a perfect world, people who were bad would be punished for being bad, and people who were good would be punished for being good. However, the world isn't perfect, so there is a series of legal ramifications and set rules in place that are put up by establishments of man, yada yada. And because of the very nature of that, of the idea that we are taking a humanity that is different compositions of gray and making them get in single file lines of black and white legality, there's always going to be overflow in one camp or the other. So that being said, Gypsy Rose did nothing wrong. Like, legitimately, this is no different than someone who's in an abusive relationship for years and constantly being beat and tormented. And Gypsy had been putting up with years of physical and mental abuse and surgery she didn't need and forced to sit in a wheelchair. And again, I know she did the murder and it wasn't technically in immediate defense of her life, but it was absolutely in defense of her life. Like, if you were in your house and someone comes up to you and they point a gun at you and you shoot them first, that's obviously self-defense, right? But if you were in your house and you were like getting water from your refrigerator and there's a guy on top of the fridge and he's pouring like poison into the water filter of the fridge, like, are you just supposed to be like, oh man, I guess I'm dead now? Like, I don't care if it's not a physical immediate attack. And yeah, I know the logical solution is Gypsy should have just stood up and went and told someone, but that's kind of ignoring all of the aspects of, Stockholm Syndrome and physical and verbal abuse itself. Gypsy was absolutely in fear of her life, and I think it's ridiculous that the legal solution for everything is that she would just sit there until she died. Also, to give you an idea of how hated Dee Dee was, whenever Dee Dee died, she was cremated, and her ashes were sent to her father and stepmother, and they flushed them down the toilet. Her own father flushed her ashes down the toilet. That's how despicable of a person this was. So, not only did Gypsy save herself, but she also did a net positive by, speeding up the whole life thing for someone who was clearly not appreciative of theirs. So while in the poster child case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, I do not think that it justifies the actions of Dee Dee, the one committing the case, but I feel it absolutely justifies the actions of the proxy itself, that being Gypsy. If we view it as a mental illness, or at least not a mental illness to the degree that it disables someone's ability to determine right or wrong, then in specific cases like this, where it's essentially a very slow murder carried out over the course of years or even decades, then I think it's perfectly reasonable for the proxy to decide that it wants to stop being a proxy. But at the end of the day, I am a guy who is telling you about this on the internet because I think it's interesting, and the truth of the matter is I don't know. And a lot of people who are experts in this field don't know as well. It is still being debated in medical circles, if Munchausen syndrome by proxy can be viewed in the way Munchausen syndrome is, in that it is an explanation for certain behaviors and possibly a justification for some. And while most have put away that idea, it is still debated if it should even be allowed to occur in any legal space, as the very existence of it implies guilt. And on top of that, should it throw a case? Because if it is something that can cause an individual to carry out these heinous acts, well, then maybe it's good to have a motive to tie in that can prove if they're guilty or not. These are all big questions, stuff that is still being debated and not a lot of people really talk about. And while it's always interesting, at least to me, to look at cases of this and try to understand human psychology and where everyone's coming from and the arguments around it, I think there is another point of interest here apart from most of my videos, because we're kind of in the conceptual stages for what could be eventual decisions when it comes to cases of child abuse or elder abuse or what have you. 10 years ago, Munchausen syndrome by proxy was a definitive surefire thing that if someone had it, lock them up straight away. And now it's kind of in the back and forth of if it's even a mental illness or not. And 10 years from now, it could be something completely different. I wanted to bring all of this to you today because it is active developments in the realm of legality in medicine, and I think that that's pretty interesting. Not the abuse and child murder part of it, the socio-political implications of it. And hey, hopefully you got something out of all of this, as I certainly did researching it and telling you about it, and I had a great time, and hopefully you had at least an okay one, and thank you for watching. I also want to say off the bat, there's a fantastic video by the Internet Investigator called Munchausen by Internet, which is about someone who convinces other people online, as in is convinced online, that she herself has several physical disabilities. And I really wanted to find a way to mention that video in here, but the only time I really mentioned Munchausen syndrome was in relation to Munchausen syndrome by proxy. So it didn't really fit, there wasn't a place to bring it up. But right here I want to say it's a great video. I'll link it below. It's really cool. She does a great job with a lot of her stuff. So yeah, I just think that it's a good video. So you should check it out if you're interested in this one. Because Munchausen syndrome, like I said, is a much more clearly defined thing. People fake their own illnesses in order to receive attention or what have you, sometimes just for the essence of being near hospitals or in caregiving positions. But it's whenever it's done to someone else, because now there's an act of violence involved. Instead of just someone harming themselves in order to get attention or whatever, it is someone hurting someone else for attention, and that throws all the cards off the table, because now we're talking about acts of violence and potentially murder in some cases, and blah blah blah. And I've talked about this long enough, I'll shut up now. But thank you for watching. If you've stuck around this long to my insane rant, this one was actually interesting. I started this out just like, oh, I'll just talk about a bunch of cases of Munchausen by proxy because I think it's interesting. And then I come across all these court records and stuff about how, like, right now it's contested if it's even a thing or not. And the video kind of morphed into, well, how about I talk about the nature of it itself, and I'll use these cases I was researching as evidence, or as, not evidence, essentially examples from either side of the aisle about, Munchausen syndrome by proxy itself. And I'm a little nervous right now, I'll admit, before editing this or anything, because I did a lot of rambling and I went a lot of different directions. I've been recording for 2.5 hours now. No idea what this will cut down to, because for one, there were several rambles that I'm probably going to have to cut, and there was also several just periods of silence where I would be mid-sentence and be like, where do I want to turn this point to? So in other words, right now I have no idea how this is going to turn out. It could be the worst video I've ever made. I'm a little worried. But I guess you guys know more than I do right now, so let me know how it went, I guess. Man, that's bizarre. Me right now doesn't know you in the future, even though for you it's the present. Anyway, enough of that esoteric stuff. My brain is fried. Thank you all for watching. If you stuck around this long, thank you so much to all of my patrons. I guess you're still the patrons to me, even though you're technically former patrons, because the Patreon's gone now. But your names are here, so thank you, my patrons, my top tier patrons, for establishing all of this and allowing this to continue to the degree it has, and it really does mean a lot, so thank you for that. Thank you so much to my subscriber. I think is my subscriber, my one subscriber, my subscribers. I think we just hit 1.1 million. So since the 1 million, since, you know, that plaque got sent and all that stuff, it's now been another 100,000 people, which I'm still amazed that 2 people watch this channel, and my mom's one of them, much less 1.1 million, like, my word. Wow. And I just did that whole random rant about the legitimacy of a court proceeding, illness, medico, whatever. Anyway, I'm going, if anyone runs this channel into the ground, I'm going to do it myself like a man. But thank you all so much for watching. I'm trying to think if there's any announcements. A lot of cool stuff coming down the pipeline. Subscribe to Winda Gang, the second channel. It's linked as always if you're interested in that. Because I'm going to be doing some cool stuff over there, you'll see. But if you're interested in second channel stuff, go over there because it's going to be more than just gaming content. I think that should about do it. I've got some cool projects down the pipeline, but not ready to talk about them yet, but exciting stuff happening. But for now, I believe that should do it. So thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.